the British bourgeoisie have committed an atrocity. These are the charges. Through a combination of methods, the British government has intentionally shaped the spread of the COVID-19 pandemic to ensure that disabled, autistic and elderly people become infected. The information to support this claim, which will be presented in detail toward the end of this video, has been available in the public domain since the end of March. Despite this, there has been no opposition to this process in Parliament whatsoever. This is starkly communicated by a cross-party report published on the 29th of July, which noted its concern at a number of methods the government have used to shape the virus's spread, but proposes neither action to prevent these methods nor consequence for the way in which they have been wielded. As such, we charge that the British government has orchestrated a eugenics campaign against the disabled, autistic and elderly, and particularly those in care. We further charge that those who hold the title of opposition have been wholly complicit in this campaign. The result is a mass murder. Between the 2nd of March and the 14th of July, disabled people, who make up around 21% of the population, accounted for 59% of Britain's COVID-19 deaths. Over a third of Britain's dead reside in care homes, a demographic representing 0.62% of the population. Whilst the particular nature of this barbarism is clearly conscious, its roots and workings cannot be explained outside of a broader political understanding of disability and capitalism. Ideology did not summon these crimes, though it certainly propelled them forward. As such, if we are to understand how to prevent this violence, we must first grasp its material basis. The oppression of disability is a product of the capitalist mode of production, whilst it would be incorrect to say that those with impairments or other conditions did not suffer unique and adverse treatment before the advent of bourgeois society. These occurrences were either limited to very particular contexts or did not represent a form of oppression distinct from that applied to others in their class. The example of chattel slavery is particularly illustrative. Those slaves with impairments generally sold at a lower price and received both more frequent and harsher physical punishment under the guise of discipline. They were kept as a quote-unquote lower quality of human commodity, rather than as a distinct social strata of slave. This expresses a general truth. In most pre-capitalist societies, those with impairments or other conditions were broadly integrated into systems of family, tribal, and colonial production. With the advent of capitalism, this began to rapidly change. As industrial means of production swept away the relations of feudalism, and the former peasantry were violently ushered to wage slavery, the modern oppression of disabled people began to take form. Families abandoned their disabled members en masse, unable to afford to support them on the pithy wages granted in exchange for the sale of their labour. Overwhelmingly unable to gain employment, disabled people found themselves trapped in a relation of exclusion and dependency. This can be seen in the enormous number of disabled people forced into workhouses or asylums. For example, by 1835, over 8,000 people with mental health problems and physical impairments were kept in Britain's workhouses, often segregated from their quote-unquote able peers. The root of this exclusion is the capitalist mode of production. The first reason for this is captured by what the writer Lauren Pass describes as productive time. Under capitalism, human labour is bought as a commodity and subsequently paid for by a measurement of time, that is, by units of hours worked. This produces a valuation of labour based upon how productive it is in relation to time, a bargain that the capitalist class continually undertake to win out on. For the worker, this manifests in a competition with other workers to secure jobs by evidencing their skill and proficiency. Bodily impairments, mental health problems, or old age are thus considered as a reason to exclude people from the evaluation, save when there is little labour left on the market or political settlements have been forced by resistance, as they appear to be insufficiently productive, would require adaptations and thus cost to render more productive, or require rest days, thus cheating the capitalist of time. Consequently, disability expresses a unique relation to the capitalist mode of production, both excluded and inseparable from the condition of the proletariat at large. A certainty for all workers without family or some other bond of economic security, when old age renders them to the same ravages. Whilst not absolute, the scale of dispossession this results in is staggering. With only 29% of people with disabilities employed in the US between 2000 and 2014, or between around 50 to 40% of people with disabilities classified as economically inactive in Britain, with considerable consistency since the 1990s as clear examples. In the oppressed world, where imperialist capital preys, disabled people face a consistent average unemployment rate of around 80 to 90%.
Think about your own life. If you had people taking care of you, making all your decisions, what is there to life, really? And almost all the social programs we set up take care of us, or put us away in institutions to be cared for.
That was the issue for me, not to look at it with someone else's eyes, and not like doctor comes on around and say, well, everything is going to be hunky-dory. Well, how do I believe him? I don't know him. I never saw anyone in wheelchair prior to that in my whole life. The doctors, for them, like the physical independence was the only means of independence at that point.
The result of this persistent mass economic exclusion is that those oppressed by disability are forced into a variety of dependencies, which function as relations of control and repression. Whether disabled people are cared for at home or in an institution, out of the pocket of their families or the bourgeois state, they are essentially incarcerated, at least in a social sense. The most evident examples of this are psychiatric wards or care homes, which structure the entirety of a disabled person's life, decide upon treatment without consultation, and will not allow release at the request of those they entomb. These are prisons where humanity is shuffled to death's door under the guise of kindness. In less extremely repressive dependencies, this relation subsists, altered only in form. This is evidenced by the process of death generated by cuts to disability benefits in Britain, which murdered over 17,500 people by early 2019. For our present purpose, it is necessary to illustrate something of the specific construction of the British care sector. As the Marxist Luke Meehan argues, the sector is plagued by three structural contradictions. Firstly, care in Britain has never been owned or run by a centralised power or the state. It is private, with certain state subsidies provided. As the industry is particularly unprofitable, it has typically attracted do-gooders. For example, the church parishes that set up the first workhouses, or the charities which today provide many services. The consequence is a fragmented industry, which organises care according to differing ideological objectives, producing frequent clashes between providers. Secondly, both what little state finance is provided to the care sector through councils and the finances of private care companies are woefully insufficient. This is clearly illustrated by the impact of austerity between 2018 and 2019, which saw almost half of all councils across Britain see the closure of domestic home care providers, and a third see residential care homes shut down. This also produces a consistent and considerable strain throughout the industry in a number of ways. For example, wages remain consistently low for difficult and intensive work, producing a revolving door of employment which sees much training rendered useless. Finally, the manner in which law around disabled people's care and autonomy works is on a case-by-case basis. This makes cases harder to resolve, necessitating hearings and expenditure. The result of all these contradictions is simple: a care sector primed to collapse under pressure, increasingly incapable of carrying out the tasks that those who depend upon it require.
It all started this morning here at the old Federal Building on 50 Fulton when an incident took place outside. Immediately after that demonstration this morning, the handicapped started invading the building. It's the old Federal Building, which is now the HEW headquarters. They spent most of the day in the office of the regional director here.
The regional director asked before 4 o'clock if he could try to get out of this room because he needed to go to the restroom. And the group here said, no, we have had to learn all of our lives to control our bladders, and you must learn that lesson now too.
To obscure the reality of disability as a particular form of class oppression, bourgeois society portrays disabled people as victims of biological misfortune, incapable of exerting their own historical agency. This venomous myth is given sharp refutation by the observation of disabled people's struggles through history. Early examples of disabled people's self-organisation are limited to particular impairments, with the British Deaf Association, founded in 1890, or the National League of the Blind, constituted as a trade union in 1899, as some clear examples. As a result, they only organised sections of those oppressed by disability and took up only certain contradictions in struggle. Aside from this, however, disabled people have often played a considerable role in other struggles. For example, a revolt by patients and nurses at the Monaghan Asylum in February 1919 led to the formation of the first Irish Soviet. It wasn't until the advent of the independent living movement, the first organisations of which formed in the US in 1972 and in Britain in 1981, that unified movements for the liberation of disabled people began to form, taking their inspiration from the work of Ed Roberts, often credited with founding the US movement. These formations were the first to argue that disability represents a socially constructed form of oppression. They organised to provide independent living centres where disabled people took ownership and command of their own care, as well as protests. Whilst nothing of a comparable scale and direction to this movement has arisen since, the tradition of disabled people's resistance lives on, with disabled people against the cuts leading much resistance against austerity in Britain following the 2008 crash.
We will no longer allow the government to oppress disabled individuals. We want the law enforced. We want no more segregation. We will accept no more discussion of segregation. And I would appreciate it if you would stop shaking your head in agreement when I don't think you understand what we are talking about.
What has caused offence is comments like suggesting enforcing the uptake of contraception to stop unplanned pregnancies, suggesting that black Americans have a lower average IQ than white Americans. And the reason there's been such a storm of protest is really because it wasn't handled very well by 10 Downing Street this morning. A number 10 spokesman was asked about this 32 times. That's a lot. And simply said, I'm not going to be commenting on individual appointments. Asked about Mr. Johnson's views, he said the PM's views on a range of subjects are well publicised and documented.
Whatever you may think of the value of IQ tests, it is surely relevant to a conversation about equality that as many as 16% of our species have an IQ below 85.
Before turning to consider the COVID-19 pandemic, it is necessary to consider the practice of eugenics, originating from the works of Darwin's cousin, Sir Francis Galton. Eugenics refers to a pseudo-scientific understanding of genetics used to justify mass murder as a means of improving the species. Its most prominent historical forms have primarily targeted those oppressed by racism or disability, and principally women, highlighting the fixtures of oppression in the capitalist economy. The most commonly known eugenics campaign in history is unavoidably the direct extermination of the Holocaust. But there are a great number of other examples and types. For example, the US began the practice of forced sterilisation in 1907 and continued this practice for decades, with states forming eugenics boards to administer such policies in the 20s and 30s. Immigrants, poor and disabled people coerced en masse into sterilisation until well into the 1970s, and a partial continuation of this process through the US's industrial prisons through to today. In Britain, the eugenics movement had broad support on both the right and the left of society through the majority of the 19th and 20th centuries. And whilst it was not able to make sterilisation legally mandatory, it allowed for a continuous coercion of its targets into such procedures by economic and social violence. Whilst the ideology and practice of eugenics are certainly upheld consistently by certain factions of the bourgeoisie in the West, it is important to say that they generally gain ground only partially, particularly since the 1970s. This is a necessary distinction if we are to grasp today's eugenicist revival, which the forced sterilisation of women in ICE concentration camps in the US clearly reveals as a phenomena stretching beyond Britain's shores. For our purposes, we must consider the British Conservative Party. Whilst its executive branch are open advocates for eugenics, the majority of the party are better described as uncaring accomplices. Through the long assault of austerity, disabled death has come to be understood as a political certainty of governance, a consequence of quote-unquote good budgetary management, which the vacant functionaries who today dole out such death have neither capacity nor will to end. This is not to say that only the executive branch are advocates for the practice. A number of Tory members, and particularly councillors, also are. But rather that a particular faction of the bourgeoisie is responsible for its practice today. A process of fascist ascendancy is underway, not completed. Enter COVID-19.
Don't forget that even if you get this illness, for the overwhelming majority of people, even in the elderly groups, it will be mild to moderate. That's where a lot of the debate has been. And one of the theories is that, perhaps you could sort of take it on the chin, take it all in one go, and allow the disease, as it were, to move through the population. Both my parents, we all have to think about. But what the Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies will be thinking about today is particularly about what we can do to help those elderly and vulnerable groups. It's not just the elderly, there are also people with pre-existing conditions or other vulnerabilities that we have to consider.
People are stockpiling.
The assault launched against disabled people at the outset of the pandemic encompasses not only the care home, but every area of life. Outside of these prisons, its principal form is abandonment, alongside the denial of healthcare. Each of these realities can be swiftly illustrated. Early into the pandemic, the Johnson government suspended the Care Act across Britain, allowing councils to end any care plans they provided, as well as diluting protections for both children in care and those with in-home care. The additional economic support that has been provided to many to help with the lockdown, introduced by the 2020 Coronavirus Act, includes no extra funds for disabled people whatsoever. So-called non-urgent surgeries, which now include cancer surgery, have been cancelled outright to free up NHS capacity. Even more disturbing than this is the blanket denial of COVID-19 treatment to disabled people. Advice produced by the National Institute for Clinical Excellence early in the pandemic suggested that a patient's viability for care be judged on a frailty scale. If they are elderly or have other conditions, initially even autism or learning difficulties. With a score of 5 or above, the criteria for which is requiring assistance managing finances or getting transport, critical care can be denied. Do not attempt resuscitation notices, ordinarily reserved for end-of-life decisions and agreed with a patient, have been suggested to Britain's disabled en masse and often applied without consultation. The depth of this barbarity is impossible to capture, but one example hints toward it. In April, the mother of a boy who has a cancerous tumour he has fought for years was asked by his GP if such a notice could be placed upon his head. He was 11 years old.
So right from the start, we've tried to throw a protective ring around our care homes. We set out our first advice in February, and as the virus grew, we strengthened it throughout.
I wonder if you will take this opportunity to apologise to those families of loved ones who died in care homes because the government didn't properly protect them.
That's the thing is, Nick. I think that's unreasonable as a question, actually. And I know you care an awful lot about this, but
in ordinary circumstances, the capitalist care home represents a prison for disabled people. Through the pandemic, it has come to function as a death camp. This is in no small part due to the structural contradictions of the British care sector, which ensured collapse under the strain of the pandemic. Something evidenced by a rising number of homes stating that the impact of the pandemic is forcing them to cut beds or close. However, there has clearly been a broad effort from the government to substantially deepen this barbarism. This is clear when it is considered that every tendency of the broader assault launched against disabled people has come to bear upon those who the sector entombs. For example, do not attempt resuscitation notices were applied to every single person living in care at the height of the pandemic, writing them off as dead. NHS visits, which care homes desperately rely upon for medical support, have been stopped. Critical care has been denied to essentially all care patients. Yet, as despicable as these actions are, they pale in comparison to the manner in which the government has shaped the spread of the virus. Between the 17th of March and the 16th of April, at least 25,000 COVID-19 patients were discharged from NHS wards into care homes without a negative COVID-19 test, many even with positive test results. Whilst care homes were granted the legal right to deny patient transfers without a negative test on the 16th of April, the practice did not cease, with many care homes reporting threats of funding cuts should they not accept patients. The extent to which this has created the process of death in the care sector is hard to overstate, with death statistics from the sector directly mirroring that seen in the health service. At the height of the pandemic, this led to the death of 400 people a day. Dependence was transformed into annihilation.
We discovered too many care homes didn't really follow the procedures in the way that they could have, but we're learning lessons the whole time. One of the most important things is to fund them properly, so we're putting another 600 million into COVID compliant care homes.
In addition to these tens of thousands of deaths from COVID-19, the care sector has been plagued with another source of mass death, namely those deaths caused by the deterioration of those with long-standing health conditions due to social isolation and the deprivation of healthcare. This is clearest with regard to dementia patients. A 52% increase in the excess death rate of this demographic recorded through the pandemic. At an overview, this isolation and deprivation produced around 10,000 excess deaths between the 2nd of March and the 12th of June. Whilst the lockdown was clearly a necessary step to provide any chance of survival for those in care, the reality is that not only has the government broken it itself, the manner in which it is being lifted has further weaponised the care home. Rather than prioritising care home visits as a life-saving measure, using all available resources to allow this ahead of other areas of lockdown being lifted during the lull of infections experienced over July and August, the government has attempted to salvage the capitalist economy by any means necessary, transforming the lockdown into a social enclosure in the process. Whilst this shows that economic interest, not public health, has been guiding the continued enclosure of those in care through this lull, there is another, far more grotesque proof. Both death and violent loneliness are proving a profitable market. As a result of the swell in deaths through the sector, insurance providers have been able to raise their costs by as much as 880%. The new AI and robotics markets are equally vampiric, with trials of robot companions for care homes in September paving the way for the mass acquisition of these devices as a remedy to the ravages of lockdown. Over the heads of the disabled, an economy of death and segregation is being erected. Over the course of 2020, we have found ourselves adrift in a sea of terrors. What we have said here accounts for but one wave, now broken upon the shores of history. As we have written and developed this piece, it has become unavoidably clear that the process it describes represents a broader tendency. The news of forced hysterectomies in ICE concentration camps, alongside the use of pepper spray and tear gas as instruments of death in these same facilities, demonstrates that the Trump administration is constructing a system of racialized industrial eugenics at a qualitatively new scale. Greece's abandonment of over 1,000 immigrants at sea, or the mass murder of Muslims in India, point to much the same tendency. The spread of COVID-19 being shaped as a viral weapon is a reality that has been felt in every general and immigration prison across the West. The ubiquity of such naked acts of genocide under bourgeois rule expresses a rather definite reality. As capitalism is falling into the midnight of collapse, war and extinction, it is everywhere forming a stone edifice of violent reaction, a purging of humanity. In a sense, this is to say that what we are experiencing is both an evil and a tragedy. For as Marx says, the bourgeoisie are but representatives of different strands of capital. The experience of care in Britain illustrates this without doubt. As costs rocketed for personal protective equipment, the absence of agency staff left slim groupings of workers with up to 70-hour weeks, and every support of dependency turned to venom. The nature of disabled people's oppression came to form a noose. Again, they were abandoned and deprived unto annihilation. The vultures pecked at the corpse as this shame of the nation was received silently, with no resistance save for accusations of incompetence. For what else can systemic exclusion produce but erasure in such times? Everything came to bear. Without outcry or challenge, a second wave is now forming. 43 outbreaks in care homes recorded in Britain in the second week of September, and government guidance published on the 16th of September reasserting that care homes must be willing to accept COVID-19 patients, now within 2 hours of a hospital discharge. And so here is another essential truth of our age. Faced with immense evil and violence, we have done nothing or little. If we do not stand to change this now, then history shall not absolve us. We feel that perhaps the perversity of the first line to be writ upon the grave of this British century illustrates this most clearly. One last fact. The overwhelming majority of care deaths in Britain were of people aged over 75, who perhaps felt that they had met something from the distant 20th century once more. And so it will be writ. First, they came for our nans, and we didn't give a fuck.